Windmere House possessed that particular quality of English country elegance that spoke not through ostentation, but through the quiet confidence of generations who had never needed to announce their consequence. The October evening had drawn its grey curtains across the Kentish countryside, and within the drawing-room, carefully placed lamps cast pools of warm light across Persian carpets and polished mahogany. The fire in the Adam fireplace whispered rather than crackled, as if it too understood the requirements of good breeding. Lady Cordelia Windmere stood beside the marble mantelpiece, her silver hair arranged with that particular care that suggests both effort and casualness, a delicate balance her lady's maid had perfected over 2 decades of service. At 65, she retained the bearing of a woman who had once commanded attention at court presentations, and still possessed the authority to orchestrate an evening's entertainment with the precision of a conductor. This evening, however, there was something in her pale blue eyes that suggested the role of hostess carried an unusual weight. The gathering itself was small, but carefully composed, like a musical arrangement where each voice had its designated part. Near the French windows that opened onto the terrace, Miss Vivian Harcourt stood in animated conversation with Sir Geoffrey Pembroke, the retired general whose weathered hands moved with military precision as he spoke. Miss Harcourt was a woman of perhaps 35, possessed of that particular kind of beauty that suggested intelligence rather than mere prettiness. Her dark hair was swept back in a style that was both fashionable and practical, and her green silk dress, while elegant, bore the subtle signs of careful economy, a hem that had been let down, sleeves that had been altered to accommodate the season's preferences. The difficulty with portraiture, she was saying, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had learned to speak properly despite humble origins, is that one must capture not merely the surface, but the truth beneath it. And truth, I'm afraid, is rarely as flattering as we might wish. Sir Geoffrey's laugh held an edge that transformed it from mere amusement into something more complex. Dangerous territory, Miss Harcourt. You'll have us all afraid to sit for you. His pale eyes, set in a face that had seen service in Burma and the northwest frontier, studied her with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading both terrain and enemy positions. Though I suppose that's rather the fascination. The risk of being truly seen. Across the room, 2 younger members of the party provided their own study and carefully managed tensions. James Windmere, Lady Cordelia's nephew and heir to the estate, possessed the lean build and restless energy of a man who had found civilian life somewhat wanting after his years as a pilot in the war. At 32, he retained the boyish charm that had made him popular at Cambridge, but there were lines around his eyes that spoke of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. His companion, Miss Diana Thornfield, was perhaps 27, with the kind of blonde beauty that graced society magazines and the sharp intelligence that made her a sought-after dinner partner among those who valued conversation as well as decoration. She was the daughter of a successful barrister and had made something of a name for herself, writing clever pieces for the better magazines, though her family's expectations ran more toward marriage than literary achievement. I still maintain, James was saying, his voice pitched low enough to suggest intimacy while remaining audible to the practiced ear, that there's something rather morbid about the whole business. This insistence on exposing every flaw and failing seems unnecessarily harsh. Diana's smile held a hint of mockery that transformed her pretty features into something more arresting. Perhaps, darling James, some of us are simply tired of pretending to be perfect. There's something rather liberating about having one's worst qualities acknowledged. It saves such tremendous energy. You speak as if you have worst qualities to display, James replied, though his tone suggested he was not entirely certain of his ground. Then you haven't been looking carefully enough, Diana said, and there was something in her voice that made James study her face with sudden attention. In the center of the room, the remaining guests completed the evening's careful composition. Mr. Reginald Thornbury, Lady Cordelia's solicitor, and a man who had managed the family's legal affairs for nearly 2 decades, stood with the slightly stooped posture of someone who spent his days bent over documents and ledgers. His grey suit was impeccably cut but conservative, and his manner suggested the careful discretion of a man who knew more family secrets than was entirely comfortable. Beside him, Dr. Marcus Whitfield represented a different sort of professional discretion, the kind that came from years of treating the ailments and anxieties of those who could afford to be particular about their physicians. He was a man of perhaps 50 with the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence, though tonight there was something in his manner that suggested his thoughts were not entirely focused on the present company. "I confess," Thornbury was saying, adjusting his spectacles with a nervous gesture that had become habitual, "that I find Miss Harcourt's approach rather unsettling. There's something to be said for maintaining certain boundaries between the public and private self." Dr. Whitfield nodded thoughtfully, though his attention seemed divided. "And yet, Thornbury, don't you think there's something rather courageous about such honesty? In my experience, most of our troubles come from the energy we expend hiding our true natures, from ourselves as much as from others." The final member of their intimate gathering stood somewhat apart, observing the social currents with the detached interest of a naturalist studying a particularly fascinating species. Professor Nigel Hartwell was a don from Oxford, a specialist in medieval literature whose reputation for brilliant scholarship was matched only by his reputation for devastating wit. He was a man of middle years who had never married, finding, as he was fond of saying, that books made more reliable companions than people and were considerably less likely to disappoint one's expectations. Mrs. Adelaide Kempton, Lady Cordelia's companion and a woman whose quiet efficiency had made her indispensable to the household, moved between the groups with the practiced invisibility of someone whose role was to anticipate needs before they were expressed. She possessed that particular quality of the truly competent servant, the ability to be simultaneously present and absent, essential yet unobtrusive. As the evening progressed, these carefully arranged social elements began to show signs of strain, like a piece of music played just slightly off-key. Conversations that should have flowed naturally seemed to require more effort than usual. Glances lingered a moment too long or were averted too quickly. The very air seemed to thicken with unspoken thoughts and carefully suppressed tensions. It was Professor Hartwell who first gave voice to the general unease, though he did so with characteristic obliqueness. "There's something rather theatrical about this evening," he observed to Mrs. Kempton as she passed near his position by the bookshelf. "As if we're all playing roles in a drama whose plot none of us quite understands." Mrs. Kempton, a woman whose years of service had taught her the value of discretion, merely smiled. "Perhaps, Professor, that's true of all social gatherings. We're all of us performing, aren't we? The question is whether we're conscious of it." "A disturbing thought," Hartwell replied, though his tone suggested he found it more intriguing than disturbing. "It makes one wonder what happens when someone decides to stop performing altogether." As if summoned by his words, a subtle change seemed to pass through the room. Lady Cordelia had moved to examine a small easel that had been placed near the fireplace, upon which rested a canvas covered by a silk cloth. Her face, as she contemplated the hidden work, took on an expression that combined curiosity with something approaching apprehension. "Miss Harcourt," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive room, "I believe you mentioned that your latest work was rather different from your usual commissions." The silence that followed seemed to expand and deepen, as if the very molecules of air had grown heavier. Miss Harcourt's face had gone very pale, but her voice, when she replied, was steady, though those who knew her well might have detected the faintest tremor. "Yes, Lady Cordelia, it is rather personal, a study in memory, one might say." "Memory can be a treacherous subject for an artist," Sir Geoffrey observed, his military bearing unable to quite conceal a sudden alertness. It has a way of revealing more than one intends. Dr. Whitfield had moved closer to the group, his professional instincts apparently aroused by some quality in Miss Harcourt's manner. "The relationship between memory and truth is complex," he said carefully. "Sometimes what we remember is more revealing than what actually occurred." The tension in the room had become almost palpable, like the electrical charge that precedes a thunderstorm. Each member of the company seemed suddenly aware that they were balanced on the edge of some revelation that might alter the careful equilibrium of their social world. It was then that Mrs. Kempton, with the practiced efficiency that had served the Windmere household for so many years, approached her employer with a small silver tray bearing a single envelope. Lady Cordelia took it with the absent gesture of someone accustomed to such interruptions, but as her eyes fell upon the direction, her composure underwent a subtle but unmistakable change. "If you will excuse me for just a moment," she said, her voice maintaining its customary authority, despite the slight tremor that those who knew her best might have detected. "Mrs. Kempton, perhaps you would be so good as to offer our guests some refreshment while I attend to this matter." As Lady Cordelia withdrew to the small writing desk by the window, the conversation resumed, but with a forced quality that suggested everyone was acutely aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath the polished surface of their gathering. The evening, which had begun with the promise of civilized entertainment, had taken on the quality of something far more complex and potentially dangerous. In the growing shadows cast by the firelight, the covered canvas on its easel seemed to preside over the company, like a silent witness to secrets that had not yet been spoken aloud. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the first act of a drama none of them had chosen was about to begin. The minute before it happened had the curious quality of composed ritual. The tray Mrs. Kempton carried was set with coffee in thin porcelain cups, a glass bowl of preserved ginger, and a small plate of lemon slices cut to exacting neatness. The butler, Telford, a grave man whose discretion had long ago hardened into practice, followed with a decanter of brandy and a frosted jug of cream. The fire whispered. Somewhere in the hall a clock, never quite punctual, counted the seconds as if they were expenditures it regretted. Lady Cordelia, having read the letter at her writing desk, folded it twice with the calm exactitude that came of a lifetime's habit. She placed it under the blotter and rested her hand for a moment on the braided edge, as if steadying herself upon a familiar thing. Then she turned back to her guests with a smile so nearly her own that only Mrs. Kempton, who had seen its authentic version, would have noticed the difference. "I think," Lady Cordelia said, glancing towards the easel, "we are all in need of a restorative. Coffee, and then, if Miss Harcourt agrees, a private word about her work." Miss Harcourt inclined her head. She had recovered some color, though her hands were clasped sufficiently tightly to show whitening at the knuckles. Sir Geoffrey, watching her, drank his coffee black with a soldier's briskness. James, who always took 2 lumps of sugar, took none. He looked at his aunt over the rim of his cup with an expression that wavered between curiosity and a concern he would not have cared to name. Diana, not drinking at all, held her saucer with the elegance of one accustomed to managing delicate objects and delicate subjects with equal tact. Conversation resumed in fragments. Thornbury murmured something about the theatre's current fare, and Professor Hartwell replied with a quotation that might have been apt or mischievous, depending upon one's ear. Dr. Whitfield, who had been unusually silent, tasted the coffee, seemed about to comment, and did not. In that room of well-educated silence, restraint gathered itself like a cat on a window-sill. "Miss Harcourt," Lady Cordelia said when the coffee had been served, "would you care to step into the morning room? We'll have a look together, shall we? Mrs. Kempton, perhaps you would be so good as to see that we are not interrupted." The 2 women left the drawing-room by the smaller door. Mrs. Kempton, with a look towards Telford that was both instruction and inquiry, followed them as far as the threshold, and then closed the door half upon its latch. The house resumed its breathing. The covered canvas stood by the fire like a guest not yet admitted to the conversation. What happened next might have been nothing at all. A minute passed, then another. The voices in the drawing room rose just enough to prove they were still there. A draught crept along the floor and touched the silk over the canvas so that it moved as if stirred by thought. In the corridor there was the slightest sound, glass against wood or china against china. A minute displacement that would in most houses have been swallowed by ordinary life. Mrs. Kempton heard it and went. She was absent, perhaps, for 2 minutes. When she returned, the angle of her face had altered so little that only the careful would have seen. She walked to Dr. Whitfield and said his name softly. He set down his cup and followed her. Their departure troubled the air without alarming it. James had risen and sat again without knowing he had done so. Sir Geoffrey's head turned a fraction. Thornbury's fingers, which were near the lemon slices, retracted as if the fruit had unexpectedly proven tart to the touch. Miss Harcourt, who had stood to steady her agitation, remained standing. Diana said almost casually, "Another log, James," and the commonplace sentence laid its fragile web over a room that had begun, without acknowledging it, to wait. It was the stillness that told them. It extended itself like an extra dimension. When Dr. Whitfield came back, he did not need to announce that something had occurred. He merely addressed Lady Cordelia's nephew with grave courtesy. "James," he said, "come." James went with him quickly. The others followed at a distance that was not too close and not unfeelingly far. The morning room, when they entered, was as composed as a photograph. The French window stood an inch open, too little to admit a draught, enough to suggest one. The lamps were lit. On a small table beside a low chair, there was a cup and saucer, a teaspoon resting upon the saucer in precisely the position an orderly person would leave it. A single lemon slice lay on a folded lace doily, untouched. The silk cloth from the easel had been drawn back a hand's breadth. The painting beneath could not yet be seen, only the smear of dark that might have been hair or shadow. Lady Cordelia sat in the low chair with her hands folded as if she had brought them together to think. Her head was turned a little to one side in a pose so natural that, for an instant, the mind refused the truth. Dr. Whitfield, kneeling very gently, did not hurry. He was not the sort of man who needed to prove competence by flurry. After a moment, he looked up. He did not say dead. He said, "There is no more to be done." And in his voice was a decent sorrow and, to the practiced ear, a reservation. There was no disorder. No cry had been given, only the terrible economy of the scene, the slight opening of the window, though Lady Cordelia disliked draughts. The coffee placed on her right when Mrs. Kempton always set it to her left. The faint fragrance of lilies from a vase she had once called vulgar and had removed from this room in the spring. Miss Harcourt, on the threshold, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and made no sound. Sir Geoffrey, after a minimal pause that might once have been parade ground respect, said, "You'll wish to send for the police, Whitfield?" The doctor nodded. Thornbury, already moving to the writing desk out of habit, checked himself and stood quite still, hands folded. Diana put her hand lightly on James's sleeve and left it there. Mrs. Kempton, with the same unhurried competence that had seen her through births and influenza and the daily warfare of domestic operation, went quietly to telephone the local station. In the morning room, the inch of unsheathed canvas stared like an unclosed eye. The house, long practiced in elegance, received its catastrophe without disturbance, and out beyond the lawns, the Kentish night breathed in, breathed out, and told no one what it knew. Windmere House received Inspector Roderick Alleyn with the tact of a well-bred hostess who, surprised by calamity, nevertheless finds the correct chair for it. The lamps had been turned down in the drawing room, the fire coaxed into steadier flame. Outside, a police motor car settled on the gravel with a soft hiss. The village constable, damp at the edges, stood in the hall with an expression of startled responsibility. Somewhere, a clock struck 10 with a discreet insistence. Alleyn's greeting to the company was formal and low. He had the look that gave older ladies confidence and younger people pause, the cultivated courtesy, the slight reserve about the eyes. He was introduced in a murmur by Dr. Whitfield. Condolences were given first, questions deferred. He asked that everyone remain together for the moment. Mrs. Kempton, whom he acknowledged with a nod that took in both her competence and her shock, undertook to seat coffee. It was done without bustle. He went first to the morning room. The constable hovered, then retreated to the corridor at a glance from Alleyn that was not unkind. The air held a faint compound of beeswax, old roses, and a gentler thread of something medicinal. Lady Cordelia sat as death had left her. Composed, hands at rest, the smallest shadow at the mouth. Nothing vulgar. He stood for a time without movement, as if the room itself might volunteer a confidence. The French window on the terrace stood 3 inches ajar. A draught had troubled the silk scarf on the back of a chair. Its end quivered almost imperceptibly. He noted the latch, down but not engaged. Beyond, the flagstones showed that deeper, nocturnal dark that takes dew. If anyone had passed that way, their trace would be a matter of shade rather than imprint. He inclined his head the necessary fraction and saw no obvious answer, which was often better than a clumsy one. On the small table beside Lady Cordelia lay the opened letter. Alleyn regarded it without touching. Cream paper, thick, from a reputable stationer. The fold was sharp, the crease unbroken by repeated handling. He could see, without stooping, the signature's anonymity. A concerned friend, its angle upright, the hand educated but cautious. The little crystal glass, half-rimmed with a faint opaline smear where the light caught it, gave off no odor that declared itself beyond the polite whisper of a mild draught and the flowers in a silver bowl. The bowl, he noticed, had been moved slightly from the center. Some mildew of condensed moisture ringed the spot it had first occupied. "Doctor," he said softly when Whitfield joined him. "You were first to her?" "Mrs. Kempton," Whitfield answered. "I followed at once. No sign of distress. The heart, perhaps. She had a prescription for a sedative. Mine, I'm afraid, but no recent complaint of sleeplessness." "Ah, the sedative." Alleyn's glance went to the glass, but did not settle there. In the cabinet, she kept such things tidily. Whitfield opened a small cupboard with the solicitousness of a man entering a sanctuary. A labeled bottle stood within, a teaspoon beside it. Nothing irregular presented itself to the eye. It very rarely did. "Thank you," Alleyn said. "We'll ask the police surgeon to attend. Meanwhile, nothing is to be moved." He looked back at Lady Cordelia, at the throat where a fine chain might have lain. The skin bore no mark of recent weight. If spectacles had hung there habitually, they did not now. On the escritoire by the window, a spectacle case stood open, empty. A trifling matter. People misplaced the very things they never misplace. He rejoined the company by degrees, sampling the geography of Windmere as he went. A portrait in the corridor, whose sitter bore Lady Cordelia's cheekbones and a more ferocious gaze. A Persian runner that had been straightened by an anxious hand, betraying its adjustment by a slight buckling against the skirting board. A faint scuff on the parquet just opposite the morning-room threshold. No more than any household might show by day's end. In the drawing-room, the covered easel remained, stately as a judge. The company arranged itself around absence. Sir Geoffrey stood, not sat. Soldiers often do when the ground is unsteady. Miss Harcourt had chosen a chair too upright for comfort. James Windmere had stationed himself by the mantel as if to hold it up by posture alone. Diana Thornfield's poise suggested both detachment and careful attendance. She was watching what she permitted herself to see. Thornbury, the solicitor, had the inward look of a man rereading advice already given. Professor Hartwell, hands lightly folded, inhabited a corner with the gravity of an amused monk. Alleyn took them in as one might take in an arrangement of flowers, not for prettiness, but for proportion and accident. He was not asking questions, he was allowing people to hear themselves. "I have to ask you to bear with a certain amount of formal nuisance," he said. His voice had the unhurried cadence that makes people breathe more slowly. "A sudden death must be treated with caution until we are comfortably assured of its nature. Dr. Whitfield has acted with propriety. A police surgeon is on his way. In the meantime, if anyone has a practical necessity, please tell Mrs. Kempton. Otherwise, I would be grateful if we remained together." No one objected. They rarely did at first. It was later that politeness began to fray. He drifted, there was no other word for it, toward the fireplace. The easel, with its veiled claim, interested him without inviting a gesture. "You had intended an unveiling this evening," he said to no one in particular, which is often the best way to permit an answer to choose its speaker. Miss Harcourt's hands tightened in her lap. "Lady Cordelia wished to see it first," she said. "Privately." "Quite proper," murmured Sir Geoffrey, and the two words carried more history than they appeared to. "The letter," Diana said, and then stopped as if she had not meant to say anything at all. Alleyn inclined his head. "Yes, a letter." Thornbury cleared his throat. "Might one ask, was there anything irregular?" "It would be premature to say so," Alleyn returned with the slightest smile. "I should be grateful if you would each, in due course, give me a brief account of the evening's shape as you saw it. Not at once. We will allow the house a little quiet first." Mrs. Kempton entered with the coffee tray. The cups, bone china with a fine hairline of gilt, chattered once against their saucers before finding their decorous rest. Alleyn watched her steady them with a touch that belonged to long practice and a day's new strain. "Mrs. Kempton," he said gently, "when you have a moment I shall be glad of a word about the household's routine. No hurry." She met his gaze without bravado. "Of course, Inspector." He took a cup and stood, as if these rooms required a man to stand. Something, perhaps only the October night pressing its black velvet against the panes, moved through the house and settled. He felt the moment when shock prepares to become memory and, in becoming, will begin to speak. Outside, there was the faintest sound from the terrace, no more than a fox deciding against audacity. Alleyn placed his cup on the mantel and turned his attention inward again. He thought of the slight, inexplicable things: the unlatched window, the displaced bowl, an empty chain and an open case, a covered portrait, a letter from an unnamed friend. None of them demanded, all of them suggested. He would begin when the surgeon had done, not with the loudest voice in the room, but with the one that had learned to be silent. Alleyn elected the little study for his conversations, a modest room at the back of the house where a single lamp made an island of light on the writing table and the shelves smelled faintly of beeswax and old calf. He had already looked his fill, quietly and without commentary, both at the morning room and at the faces of the company when the news had come. Now he sat with a notebook open and a fountain pen poised as if it might choose, of its own volition, when to write. He began, as habit and temperament inclined him, with civility. Miss Harcourt faced him first, upright in the hard chair as if any softening might cause her to unravel. Up close, the green silk made a quiet rustle when she breathed, and the fine bones of her face seemed sharpened by fatigue. "You were to speak with Lady Cordelia about your painting," Alleyn said. "What sort of speaking was intended?" "Clarification," she replied, and the word came out carefully. She had asked me to undertake something unusual, not a portrait in the conventional sense, a study of people connected with the house. She wished to reflect a truth she felt the family neglected. She lifted her gaze. She said it would be moderate and tasteful. I took her at her word. And was it moderate and tasteful? Miss Harcourt's lips moved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Truth rarely is, Mr. Alleyn, but I did not set out to wound. I would not have done it at all without her insistence. He let a breath move the silence between them. You received no communication from her earlier today? No letter? No, nothing. After a beat, if Lady Cordelia wrote letters about paintings, she did not send them to me. Alleyn thanked her and let her go. She rose without haste and left as one who knows that the true interview begins when one returns to the company and tries to resume the old conversation. James Windmere came next, looking slightly winded, as if all this had imposed an altitude upon the evening. He toyed with a signet ring and tried to be helpful. My aunt was formidable, he said. She disliked fuss and wouldn't have made it unless compelled. If she'd felt unwell, she'd have said so and retired. I can't think your aunt was aware of this painting's tenor, Alleyn asked. She anticipated the effect upon her family. James coloured. We're not a family of hysterics. If Miss Harcourt, wished to be daring, my aunt would have dealt with it. She enjoyed a measured scandal, provided she held the reins. You're heir to Windmere. Does that entail unusual vulnerabilities? Alleyn's tone was conversational. The question was not. James's ring paused. Financially, it's not what it was. Land never is now, but there's no crisis. If you're implying that anyone's inheritance depends on my aunt's temper, then no, she... He stopped, then smiled with a charm that did not quite reach his eyes. We're all very respectable, Mr. Alleyn. It's frightfully dull. Of course, Alleyn said, and let him go. Diana Thornfield took the chair as if it were a platform. Her poise was a shield one admired even while noting that it existed. You observe for a living, Alleyn said, and cast your observations as prose. What did you observe this evening? That we were performing the part of the polished country party, Diana replied, and that the script was snatched away when the letter arrived. Miss Harcourt turned alarming colours. James tried not to. Sir Geoffrey watched as if the enemy had moved on the flank. Dr. Whitfield listened for symptoms. And you? I counted breaths, she said lightly. Then, playing fair, Mrs. Kempton's. They shortened. I couldn't tell whether from fear or duty. Did you see anyone leave the drawing room before Mrs. Kempton fetched Dr. Whitfield? Only Mrs. Kempton, and James for a moment, to the decanters. He returned immediately. Sir Geoffrey Pembroke presented an economy of movement and word. He sat squarely, regarded Alleyn as one professional might regard another, and offered the sort of answers that gave nothing to rumour. Her ladyship was a commander, he said. She managed situations. Tonight something managed her. I dislike that. Did you step out? To the terrace, perhaps? Alleyn asked. Sir Geoffrey's eyes did not flicker. No, draughts disagree with my leg. A pause. The French door was not ajar when I last noticed it, which was before Lady Cordelia left the room. Ah, Alleyn said gently. And when did you last notice it? Sir Geoffrey considered. We had a small exchange about weather and damp. 10 minutes before Mrs. Kempton returned? I'm not a clock. Dr. Whitfield was grave and careful, his precision tempered by the humanity that had made him trusted. She had been very well, he said. Slight insomnia some months ago, much improved. No heart complaint. The sedative is mild. Milder than most brandies in this house. You prescribed the dose? Alleyn asked. Yes. The bottle is in the cabinet of the morning room. I saw it. After a moment. You'll find the glass. I didn't move it. And the letter. I read the salutation at Mrs. Kempton's request when we found her. Nothing more. The rest is for your people. Mr. Thornbury, the solicitor, arrived looking as if ink had stained his marrow. He avoided the lamp's circle as if it might draw confidences out of him. Lady Cordelia loved order, he said. We were to meet next week about minor settlements. Nothing that would bring this about, Inspector. Any quarrels? We are English, he said, almost dry. We do not quarrel. We adjust. Professor Hartwell lounged and watched his own smoke as if it might write something amusing on the air. You will have noticed, he said, that people have arranged themselves into attitudes. It is what they do when they feel examined. You don't? Alleyn asked. I lecture, Hartwell said. It is not the same. And because pattern required it, Alleyn left Mrs. Kempton for last. She sat very straight, her hands folded with that economy of gesture that belongs to a profession in which one is never meant to draw the eye. Mrs. Kempton, he said kindly, tell me what you saw and what you did not see. I saw her ladyship receive a letter, sir, she said, eyes on his tie-pin. I did not see who delivered it. I saw her retire to the morning room. I did not see anyone follow. And you noticed the French window? I noticed that it was not as she would have it, Mrs. Kempton said after a breath. Her ladyship disliked night air. Alleyn waited, because silence often does more work than a question. After a moment, Mrs. Kempton added, she wore her glasses always when reading. They were not on her person. You know where she kept a second pair? In the drawer by the lamp, Mrs. Kempton said. It was closed. Alleyn nodded. He wrote nothing. The night had gathered itself close to the windows, and the house had taken on that watchful hush that attends a secret. He thanked her and stood. In the corridor, beyond the little study, the carpet kept its counsel. Somewhere, a clock tested the air with a solitary chime, as if to rehearse for the hour that would come. Alleyn moved back toward the drawing room, where the covered easel waited like a question posed and not yet answered. He had what he required for the present. Not answers, but arrangements of character in which answers might presently show themselves. By late morning, the house had arranged itself into two worlds again. The public rooms where voices were gentle and grief well-mannered, and the service quarters where the air smelled of blacklead and soap and words were used sparingly. Alleyn preferred to begin there. It was not that servants told more than their masters. It was that they noticed what their masters did not, and when they held back, the omission often spoke as clearly as any statement. Mrs. Kempton brought him to the servants' hall and left him with a quiet word to Mrs. Baines, the cook, who sat like a benevolent magistrate over the comforts of the place. Inspector Fox took a stool near the range without fuss. Tea appeared, as it must. The butler, Frobisher, entered with a gravity appropriate to the house's misfortune. He was a tall man of late middle age, with a way of standing that suggested his back knew every cupboard in Windmere. He placed his hands along the table's edge with ritual exactness. The Evening Post? Alleyn asked, as if it were a matter of pleasing pedantry. Delivered at 8, sir, Frobisher replied. Sorted in the pantry as usual, and placed upon the salver for her ladyship. Mrs. Kempton presented them to Lady Cordelia in the drawing-room. And the particular envelope that caused her to withdraw? Frobisher's gaze did not alter. It was amongst the others. Cream paper. No crest. He paused. No stamp. Fox's pencil made the smallest tap. No stamp? The village bag sometimes includes hand-delivered items, Inspector, Frobisher said, with the imperturbable tone of a man accustomed to smoothing irregularities until they appeared entirely proper. Tradesmen's notes. Return invitations. I did not scrutinize each envelope. Alleyn allowed the silence to hold a moment. He watched how Frobisher accepted it. The slightest tightening at the jaw was his only response. Loyalty, certainly. Discretion, certainly. A small, lucid reluctance about the origin of that letter, almost as if naming it would be an impropriety. The morning-room window, Alleyn said mildly. Would it normally stand ajar at that hour? It would not, sir. This from Mrs. Baines, unexpected and unrepentant. Her ladyship did not care for a draught upon the neck. Frobisher inclined his head a fraction. The closing of windows is the housemaid's office on her evening round. Then we must trouble the eye. Housemaid, Alleyn said. The housemaid, Nora, came with her hands scrubbed and her eyes solemn. She stood straight, as if the kitchen dresser were a judge. You shut the morning-room window. At 8:30, sir. I did the drawing-room at the quarter after, as there were guests. The morning-room first, then the library grate, then the passage lamps. You are sure of the times. The clock on the passage chest struck the half as I put the latch to. The corridor clock is quick, sir. Fox, content as a cat in a warm chair, looked at his boots. And you noticed anything else? Nora's eyes slid briefly to Frobisher, and back. The drawer by the lamp. Her ladyship keeps a spare pair of spectacles in it. I'd left it a thought open earlier in the day, for her convenience. Alleyn glanced up. Earlier. In the afternoon, sir, after dusting. Mrs. Kempton told me to keep them handy these last weeks. Her hands pinched themselves together. But the drawer was shut when I came back at 8:30. I didn't open it again. Who closes what Nora leaves ready? Mrs. Baines muttered, but Frobisher's look restored decorum. Alleyn let it pass. Thank you, Nora. You may go. He asked for the lady's maid, Ellis. She arrived with the compact competence of a woman who knew her duties so well that their absence for one day had unbalanced the whole house. Miss Ellis, Alleyn said, you arranged Lady Cordelia before dinner. As usual, sir. The pearl brooch, the blue silk, her reading chain. A breath. I fastened it myself. Her medicines. In the cabinet in her dressing room, sir. Locked. The key on Mrs. Kempton's ring. Her ladyship sometimes took her drops after tea if she felt it would be a late evening. Dr. Whitfield's new bottle came last week. I measure a teaspoon when required. You measured last night? No, sir. Her voice remained calm, but it seemed to grow smaller, as if trying to make itself less noticeable. There was no instruction. Mrs. Kempton took the tray to the drawing-room. And later? Ellis looked down at her folded hands. I heard the little bell in the morning corridor at 9:10. It's a faint bell, the morning-room bell. She raised her eyes. I was in the passage airing the linen cupboard. Then I heard nothing. Only someone moving quickly. Shoes on the runner. I couldn't say who. Thank you, Alleyn said. That is very helpful. It was not what Ellis had said that interested him most. It was the things she had stepped around with neat feet. The cabinet, the key, the new bottle. She had placed each where it properly belonged, and, in doing so, suggested where any improper act would have to trespass. From the yard door came a faint draft and a smell of damp gravel. The chauffeur, Pritchard, appeared in his sleeves, cap in hand. You were out last evening? Alleyn asked, as one might ask after the health of a horse. Took the professor to the station in the afternoon, sir. Back by 6. After supper, I was in the garage mostly. Did you convey any message? A lad brought an envelope on a bicycle, sir, about 9. Tradesman's entrance. Said it was urgent for her ladyship. I gave it to Millie, the under-housemaid. She took it to the pantry. Alleyn inclined his head. You noticed the lad? Cap too big for him, one of the village lot? No stamp on the envelope, if you take my meaning. I do, Alleyn said. He thanked them all. The courtesy cost nothing and bought something valuable. For even in their restraint, the servants had provided him with a map, the path of an unstamped letter through the proper channels, a window shut by habit and later found ajar, a drawer that should have been ready and was, at some point, made correct, a faint bell that cried for service and was answered by silence and quick feet. He stood with Fox in the green baize corridor where the hush had the quality of old wool. They'll not say what they know, Fox observed. Not yet. No, Alleyn agreed, but they've told us what they do. Which is? He looked toward the invisible geometry of rooms and routines. They do precisely what they always do, Brer Fox. And somewhere in that clockwork, some small cog turned the wrong way. Fox's pencil tapped once more. You've seen it? Not seen, Alleyn said. Felt. He glanced, almost absently, at the bell board where a faint brass lozenge marked morning room still shivered with the memory of a summons. Let's go back through the rounds, step by step. When one knows the ritual, the profanation stands out. He made no more of it than that. The servants had given him their silences and their routines. In the one, he heard loyalty. In the other, a flaw. And flaws, in houses as in people, had a way of widening when touched. The morning room, revisited in the dull light that follows a sleepless night, offered itself to Alleyn as a place of small obediences and one disobedience too many. It was a room with rules. The flowers arranged low so as not to interrupt conversation. The lamp turned a fraction toward the chair to spare the eyes. The ashtray never used, as Lady Cordelia disliked the smell of smoke in the morning room, though she tolerated it elsewhere. A clock wound on Sundays, a bell to summon, a drawer left, by Mrs. Kempton's admitted habit, slightly open for spectacles that were always to hand. Alleyn stood quietly between the chair and the little table, his hands behind his back, as if the least movement might alarm the objects into scattering their secrets. He allowed the staff to gather without being told. Mrs. Kempton, precise even in grief. Frobisher, a monument of propriety. Mary, pale and determined not to drop the salver she held. "Would you be kind?" "Enough," Alleyn said, "to tell me how this table is ordinarily arranged when her ladyship expects to sit here after dinner." Mrs. Kempton answered at once. She was a woman who understood furniture as one understands old friends. "The lamp, as you see it, sir. A small vase, the day's post on a silver letter tray. If she took tea, the teacup would be of the Wedgwood set, blue with a white border. Milk jug, no lemon. Her ladyship thought lemon vulgar after 6 o'clock. The bell by her right hand. And the glass." Alleyn indicated the crystal. Tiny congealed tracks of something clear had dried in descending beads along the inside, faint as a watermark. "Is that usual?" "No, sir," Mrs. Kempton said. "Her ladyship would take a draught at bedtime if she could not sleep. Upstairs in warm milk. Never spirits, never here." Frobisher inclined his head a fraction. "The crystal is not kept in this room, sir, but in the long cabinet in the drawing-room, a liqueur service. We should not bring it here unless specifically bidden." "Were you bidden yesterday?" "No, sir." Mary's voice, careful and small, came in after a beat. "I took in tea at 8:15, sir." "Just tea." She tightened her hold on the salver. The crystal glass was not there then. Alleyn nodded and let his gaze rest upon the ring the glass had left on the polished wood, a pale, sticky circle that caught the light. He touched it delicately with a fingertip, lifted it to his nose. The faintest sweetness. Not sherry, not brandy. Something perfumed, unassertive, too mannered to be taken by a woman who liked things plain. "You'll forgive me," he said, "for asking you to indulge me in memory. Mrs. Kempton, when you left the drawer ajar yesterday, was it as it is now?" "No, Inspector. I left it open the breadth of a finger. I've done so of late because her ladyship's hands were—" She made a small, controlled gesture. "It was easier. I found it shut when we came in." "By whom?" She shook her head. "I cannot say." Alleyn opened the drawer with a gentle movement. A neat interior, a second pair of spectacles, folded, a small ivory-handled paper knife, a pencil worn to a stubble, a hotel notepaper envelope, empty, foreign, old, kept because Lady Cordelia kept everything, and a little curved measure, bone stained along one side with something that had dried palely and not quite been cleaned off. He held it a moment against the light. It belonged to the upstairs medicine shelf by rights. It did not, by any ritual he had heard described, live here. He replaced it. "Thank you." He went next to the letter. The cream paper lay squarely where Dr. Whitfield had set it aside. Alleyn did not touch it at once. Instead, he looked at the blotter as one looks at the face of a compliant friend. He turned back the blotting paper gently and saw the faint mirror of the last few words. He thought of those meticulous habits, the careful blotting, the deliberate closing of drawers. He thought also of the time, 9:30, and of the mantel clock which, he glanced at it now, kept good time. Frobisher would see to that. "Frobisher," he said mildly, "you wind this clock on Sundays, you say?" "Yes, sir, after chapel." "Has it stopped lately?" "No, sir." "Never?" Alleyn listened to it tick. A composed domestic sound, a metronome for propriety. Fox, who had been silent, stepped to the French windows and ran a hand over the brass fastener. "Open last night," he said. "No marks on the terrace." He tested the catch. "The latch is set down." "They are customarily left thus?" Alleyn asked. "Never, Inspector," Mrs. Kempton said quietly. "Her ladyship disliked draughts, as you know. The window is opened after breakfast and shut at 5 o'clock winter evenings." So the window was opened and then carefully latched down again from inside. He let the silence consider that for them. Alleyn returned to the crystal glass. "Dr. Whitfield spoke of a heavier dose than usual," he said, not as a question. He looked past Mrs. Kempton, beyond the door, as if there were a line traced in air between this room and the little upper landing where private things lived in bottles and locks. "Would you show me, Mrs. Kempton, where Lady Cordelia kept her sedative?" In her bedchamber, the bed was made with a precision that felt almost accusatory. On a shelf in a small cupboard were the sensible paraphernalia of a woman who had long since ceased to be romantic about her body. Linseed, a jar of cold cream, smelling salts, a blue-labeled bottle with his own name in small, neat type beneath the chemist's. The cork fitted snugly. The liquid inside was clear, respectable, unperfumed. Alleyn measured its weight with his hand, as if that might tell him what it needed to. The little bone measure had its place here, empty. He noted that place and kept his counsel. As they returned to the morning room, he saw anew the covered easel by the fireplace, that sardonic sentinel of their evening. He paused by it. The silk cover was secured by a knot, a simple loop that would come away with one pull. Someone had undone it after dinner and tied it again, not badly, but not as neatly as Mrs. Kempton would have done. There was a little snag near the hem where a ring had caught the weave. He did not touch it. He did not touch anything. He stood in the center and let the room tell him, in its polite voice, what it always did and what it had done last night that it should not. When he spoke, it was in a tone that left everyone's dignity intact. "Thank you," he said. "I'm most obliged." They went, and Fox, beside him, said only, "Well?" "Not yet," Alleyn replied. "But we are no longer guessing in the dark. Lady Cordelia did not take her draught here by habit, yet here it is. Perfumed and in the wrong glass. A drawer left open out of kindness, closed again out of something else. A window opened to make a point and then closed properly to make another. And a knot retied by an unpracticed hand. In a house where everything is habitual, Fox, the smallest discourtesy to habit, is an announcement. He turned to the French window and looked out at the pale lawn. A rook, late to the matter, lifted off the yew and went steadily toward the wood. Somewhere in the house, a bell sounded. A plain domestic note, summoning someone to someone. "Listen," he said softly. "The house has decided to tell us something." It was not melodrama that followed, but a small alteration in the day's routine, a ripple that would, in its quiet way, disturb the surface. A note arrived where notes did not usually arrive. Or perhaps a person missed where a person was never late. The first whisper of the second act began to gather itself, and Windmere House, immaculately run, shifted almost imperceptibly on its axis to accommodate it. The morning room, revisited in daylight, gave up its details with the gentle reluctance of an old retainer. Alleyn stood by the little table, hands behind his back, looking not at Lady Cordelia's chair, now empty, but at the small objects that had survived the night without change. Fox waited by the door with the unobtrusive patience that came of long practice. "Let's take it as she would have," Alleyn said softly. "At the hour. The letter. The draft." He touched nothing, but his eyes traveled from bell to glass to lamp as if reading a familiar line of script. The silver bell sat within a faintly visible ring on the polished wood, a fraction out of register with the paler circle it habitually covered. The lamp, a delicate Sheffield piece, had its shade tilted at an angle that threw a clean oval of light onto the second chair rather than the little table. The French window stood open by a cautious inch. The glass, the small crystal tumbler prescribed for her sedative, held a pale amber residue that clung viscously to the sides. Frobisher, summoned to the threshold and questioned with courtesy, confirmed what the room implied. "Her ladyship preferred the lamp pointed down, sir. She disliked glare in the eyes, and she never tolerated the window ajar in the evening." "The bell?" Alleyn asked. "Her ladyship rang it even for trifles, sir. She would not have hesitated." Alleyn thanked him, and, when they were alone, drew nearer to the table. He bent and took in, without touching, the faint sparkle of undissolved crystals on the inner curve of the glass. It had the sticky look of sweetened liquid dried overnight. Elsewhere, on the saucer beneath the glass, a half-ring of fine sugar grit caught the light like frost. Fox, stooping with him, murmured, "She took her draught sweet, sir?" "No," Alleyn said. "That, I think, is the point." He found Mrs. Kempton in the corridor and asked her, not about poison or letters, but about the small habits of a careful life. Sugar? She was prompt and certain. Her ladyship never took it, not in tea, not in coffee, and certainly not with medicines. She thought it masked taste and led to excess. The sugar spoon would not have been used for her. And yet, Alleyn returned to the room with her and indicated the tray. The sugar tongs lay slightly askew, not quite parallel to the edge as a tidy hand would set them. The spoon itself, placed in its bowl, shone with a faint glisten of having been dipped and wiped rather than washed. A napkin bore a small translucent crescent where it had absorbed liquid and a sprinkling of grit. "Someone prepared it to be sweet," he said mildly, "or altered it after." Mrs. Kempton's composure held, but her hands folded more tightly. "It was not I, Inspector. I'm not suggesting it, only that some custom was broken here." He turned then to the letter. The cream paper, with its elegant hand, lay in a perfect line with the blotter. Alleyn studied its opened edge, a ragged tear, not the clean slit of a paper knife. On the desk, the little ivory knife lay precisely where one might expect it, its blade clean, the edge delicate. Lady Cordelia, by all accounts, was a woman of careful instruments and unhurried manners. To tear a letter, to tilt a shade, to tolerate a draught, to sweeten a draught. These were small ruptures in a settled order. He shifted his attention to the spare spectacles. The drawer, which Mrs. Kempton had admitted she left fractionally open of an evening for convenience, had been found closed. Now, opened by Alleyn's gentle hand, it offered a neat case and a folded handkerchief scented faintly with iris. The handkerchief's fold was reversed from the tight squares of proper linen. Someone else's hand had returned it, not hers. He replaced it as he had found it. Who was she when she died? He asked of no one in particular. A woman in her chair, by her lamp, with a letter before her, but the room whispers that she was not the mistress of her rituals at the end. He crossed to the French window and looked on to the terrace. The flagstones, dulled by night moisture, held no clear impression of an approach. A single leaf had blown inward and lay just touching the hem of the curtain. The window's latch showed a shining scrape where a ring or key might have knocked it open. He stood very still for a time, thinking of rhythm. Houses like Windmere ticked in their way, and Lady Cordelia had been its regulator. Someone, last night, had moved the hands forward a minute here, a minute there, until the hour struck wrong without sounding any alarm. When he left the room, he carried nothing with him but a quiet certainty. "When a habit breaks," he said to Fox in the corridor, "it shouts if one is listening." She did not ring, she did not sweeten, she did not tear, yet the bell moved. The draught was sweet, the letter ragged. We are to believe in haste and frailty. I'm not certain I do. Fox, who valued plain words, nodded. "What do you want next, sir?" "The origin of that paper," Alleyn said, thinking of the letter's texture under his gaze. "And the story of the sugar, who touched it and when. Also, have a word with the parlour-maid about lamps. Let us see who tilts shades at Windmere." He paused, then added, "And we shall gently ask Miss Harcourt to show us her canvas. Rituals of viewing have their own truths." He did not hurry. The house would yield its next admission when it must. For the moment, a sweetened glass and a torn letter said enough. Someone had played a small, deliberate note out of key, confident that no one in polite company would remark on it. Chapter 7. A second stirring or silent collapse. It was Fox who found the second note, not in the morning room, nor among Lady Cordelia's papers, but slid, with an almost timid exactness, beneath the door of the small music room where, during anxious mornings, Mrs. Kempton allowed the young parlour-maid to dust without supervision. "Just here, sir," Fox said, holding it flat on his palm. "Unaddressed. Same paper to the feel, if I'm any judge." He was, as it happened. Alleyn took the envelope and weighed it lightly. The cream was fine, the decal edge familiar. Inside, a single line written in a rounder hand than last night's. It would be wiser to remove the picture before it is seen. A friend. There was no signature, no initials. The writing had a schoolroom neatness to it, lacking the slanted assurance of the first message. Yet the paper sang the same note. Alleyn looked up to find Mrs. Kempton, pale and unsleeping, at the threshold. "It was pushed under not 10 minutes ago, Inspector." Mary heard the whisper of it. The corridor was empty when she looked. He nodded and sent Fox to learn which outer doors had been used since breakfast, then asked quietly that Miss Harcourt be invited to the library. He did not show her the note at once. Instead, he inquired, with the gentleness that had been useful to him among actors and invalids alike, if she would be willing to let him see the covered canvas. She hesitated with a visible effort to steady herself. "I had thought, after last night, that perhaps it would be kinder to put it away." "Perhaps it would. But we might look, you and I, and decide together." They went to the drawing-room. The silk cloth lay as before, with the faintest disturbance in its drape that suggested an anxious hand had checked its security more than once. Alleyn lifted the cloth no more than an inch. He saw enough to recognize a sensitive, unsparing hand. A woman's face in cool tones, not young, not old, with an expression as grave as a late afternoon. He lowered the cloth and made no comment. It was not yet time. "Who advised you to make it?" he asked. "Lady Cordelia, Sir, Miss Harcourt's voice was little more than breath. She asked for truth." "And others?" He glanced, not at the canvas, but at her hands. They were steadier now, as if the act of standing before her work had restored some inner balance. "Did any of the household know its subject?" Mrs. Kempton suspected. Sir Geoffrey, he looked and turned away. Mr. Thornbury. He disapproved of anything that might be construed as revelation. She swallowed. Miss Thornfield was curious. James was. She broke off. James was what? "Afraid," she said, surprising herself with the word. They returned to the library by a route that took them past the morning room. In the corridor, Diana Thornfield waited with a cup of tea in her hands. She had the look of someone who has slept badly and met a mirror without recognition. When she caught sight of Alleyn, she made a small apology and turned to go, then swayed a fraction, enough to bring the tea gently against the rim and over in a faint spill. "Forgive me," she said. "I seem clumsy this morning." Dr. Whitfield appeared from an adjoining room with quiet promptness. "You'll sit down," he said, taking the cup from her. "How many cups have you had?" "1. 2. Diana's smile tried and failed. "It's nothing. Only this house feels as if it has lost its center, doesn't it?" "Rest," the doctor said. He glanced at Alleyn with a look that encompassed both medicine and complicity. Stress. Nothing more. Perhaps it was. Yet Alleyn's gaze went at once to the tea tray on the small side table, cups impeccably arranged, lemon in thin crescents, sugar lumps in a Georgian bowl. The sugar tongs were set with their bows outward, neat as a diagram. He noticed that the topmost lump had a tiny indentation, as if taken up and set down again by an uncertain hand. Fox returned, unobtrusive as a shadow. "Side door open to the terrace at 8:15, sir. Frobisher admits to airing the hall. No other entries since then, so far as can be seen. No footprints of use." Alleyn gave him the note. "A friend grows industrious." Fox lowered his voice. "Paper watermarked Hallowell & Co. St. James's, not a village purchase." "Thornbury's stationer?" Alleyn asked without emphasis. "Possibly. The solicitor's correspondence bears the same." They both looked up as Mr. Thornbury himself entered. He seemed more shrunken than the day before, as if grief and responsibility had gnawed at him in the night. He clutched a thin leather portfolio and avoided the sight of the covered easel, though they were not even in the same room. "Inspector," he said, and offered a tight smile. "I wonder if I might, if you're finished with the morning room, recover certain papers for the executors." "Not quite yet," Alleyn said, "but there is no immediate impediment to your making a list in my presence later. Today." "Of course," Thornbury murmured. He did not ask for permission to leave that minute. Instead, he sat uninvited in one of the library chairs, placed his portfolio on his knees, and stared fixedly at his hands. They were clean, the nails precise, the skin over the knuckles shiny with soap. If he was performing, it was for himself. The house, which had held its breath through the night, began to exhale slowly, but the air it released was not clear. Another note had come, in the same good paper with a different hand. A young woman trembled and spilled her tea. A solicitor hovered by his portfolio. A portrait waited under silk. Alleyn stood very still and let the weight of these small alterations settle. He would not yet call them clues. They were stirrings, eddies in the current, suggesting that whoever had moved a bell and sweetened a glass had not finished shaping the day to their purpose. Evening deepened without ostentation. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn. The hush that fell on Windmere House was not the hush of fear, but that of anticipation. In such silences, Alleyn's mind tended to order itself, choosing what to credit and what to set aside, allowing character to weigh more heavily than circumstance. He thought of Lady Cordelia, a woman of measured habits, strong opinions about draughts and drink, a punctiliousness about bells and drawers, and the small proprieties of time. If death had visited her disguised as kindness, then the disguise would have been fashioned by someone who understood that ritual intimately, someone whose hand could close a drawer because it ought to be closed, whose notion of tidiness included straightening inkstands, who knew without thinking which glass belonged to which tray. Mrs. Kempton knew such things, of course, but her competence had the transparency of devoted service. Frobisher knew them, and knew how to efface himself. Mary knew them as a maid learns by imitation. But in the drawing-room there were others whose lives had been rehearsals in the manners of houses like this. Sir Geoffrey with his soldier's exactitude, Dr. Whitfield with his physician's tidiness, Mr. Thornbury with his solicitor's care, Diana Thornfield with a journalist's alertness to appearances, Professor Hartwell with a scholar's fastidiousness. James Windmere, too, had grown up in these rooms. He would unconsciously straighten a coaster that offended his eye. He set these reflections aside and considered motive. The missing codicil whispered of money or of control. The letter, a concerned friend, whispered of influence, perhaps of a past untidiness now desired to be made orderly by the destruction of a picture. Miss Harcourt's fear, Sir Geoffrey's watchfulness, Thornbury's fretfulness, James's self-protective charm, each came with a history. Alleyn had learned long ago that history, not opportunity, usually shaped crime. Fox entered with a paper folded once and laid flat. "From the county pathologist, sir. Quick work." Alleyn read and allowed himself only the smallest shift of expression. He replaced the paper on the table between them as if it were a visiting card. As we guessed, a quantity far in excess of the prescribed dose, possibly compounded. Accident unlikely, then. Let us not harden quite yet. But yes, unlikely. He asked Fox to have a quiet word with the local stationer about coroneted writing paper and to make discreet inquiries about who might hold keys to small cabinets in large houses. Also, Fox, ask Frobisher to tell you, without any suggestion that he is under suspicion, whether Lady Cordelia ever entrusted her key to anyone for convenience sake. Very good, sir. Alleyn remained alone a moment longer. He went to the French window and closed it the last fraction of an inch, feeling the latch give with that particular resistance that comes from long use. He thought of the letter's phrase, "the matter we discussed," and wondered when and where that discussion had occurred. Not here, perhaps. A person who required anonymity in writing might prefer the confidentiality of a garden path or a morning drive. He returned to the covered painting and examined the drape's fastening. 2 small silk cords, one of which had been retied, recently, and with an unfamiliar economy. The knot was competent, not elegant. He smiled inwardly at the foolishness of knots as evidence, yet he put the detail with the others. People tied things as they lived, some with flourish, some with function. When the household assembled, it did so with a decorum that permitted untruths only by omission. Sir Geoffrey stood a little apart, as if guarding something invisible. James in his place by the mantel with eyes that refused quite to settle. Diana Thornfield watchful, her intelligence a lamp turned low to conserve wick. Thornbury pinched with worry. Dr. Whitfield grave. Miss Harcourt pale but self-possessed. Professor Hartwell curious despite himself. Mrs. Kempton a composed axis around which the house revolved. Frobisher a shadow of that axis. Mary at the edge, all attentive nerves. Alleyn did not unmask or accuse. He spoke of necessity and of kindness. "We will look at the picture soon," he said, not to gratify curiosity but to prevent harm, because secrecy, when applied to truth, tends to provoke follies worse than truth itself. He let the sentence land and rest. He saw how each person received it. He thought, very quietly, of guilt, not as a melodramatic stain, but as a private arrangement of motives. Love turned clumsy, fear turned officious, pride turned corrective. When he ended the little address, he did not at once reach for the silk drape. Instead, he asked each to take a place where they might see comfortably and, with a courtesy that was almost tender, requested Mrs. Kempton to sit rather than stand. "Inspector," she said, surprised. "Indulge me." He replied. Then, and only then, he set his hand to the veil. He did not yet lift it. He let his fingers rest upon the silk as a musician rests his hand upon a keyboard before the first note. And as the house held its breath altogether, Alleyn's intuition, having gathered its fine dust from bell and drawer, from glass and knot and paper, arranged itself into a pattern he chose, for the moment, to keep entirely to himself. Alleyn elected, after a breakfast of deliberate quiet and much walking the gravel paths alone, to restore as far as possible the ordinary ceremony of the house. He had learned, long ago, that truth was more often coaxed than stormed, and that certain kinds of guilt found their way to light when the familiar rituals were made to resume their course with just the slightest alteration of compass. By his request, the company assembled in the drawing room at 11. The October light lay thin upon the lawns. A faint gleam found its way across the parquet and set a small, insistent dazzle in the glass of the French windows. Mrs. Kempton, who had contrived the tray with coffee and a discreet decanter of plain water in place of the usual brandy, moved to and fro with that noiseless authority which had so long sustained Windmere House. "I am indebted to you," Alleyn said, when they were settled. "It is a peculiar imposition, this invasion of grief by official duty, and I ask your patience a little longer." He paused, letting the silence rest, not heavy but consequential. "There is one matter upon which I must touch. Lady Cordelia's last concern, as expressed in her arrangements for last evening, was a work of art which she believed would restore a kind of order to the family's history. It seems to me not improper, if Miss Harcourt will permit it, that we honor that intention. Not to gratify curiosity," he added, and in the brief glance he bestowed on James Windmere there was something kind rather than rebuking, "but to restore the interrupted sequence of the household's life." Miss Harcourt, colorless but composed, inclined her head. "If it must be done, Inspector, let it be done as she wished." Her voice, stripped of the bright resourcefulness in which she usually clothed it, retained a clear steadiness. Frobisher and a footman brought the easel forward and, with that careful gravity which attends both art and death, set it near the fireplace. The silk cover, Lady Cordelia's choice, was lifted away. The painting did not shout. It arranged its symbols with the same economy and courtesy that had governed the house. The long field under a thin autumn sky, a belt of coppice, the white flash of a bird at flush, and, in the foreground, a hunting stock laid across a ledger whose pages showed, not numerals, but the delicate suggestion of interlaced initials and a date. Near the ledger, quietly, as if misplaced by a distracted hand, a service bell-pull lay coiled, its tassel a dull green. A half-seen figure at the field's edge seemed less a person than the idea of one. Presence, not identity. It was not a portrait of a man so much as a map of an occasion. No one spoke at first. The house, through its people, received the image and held it. Alleyn watched their faces as he would have watched a slow tide. Sir Geoffrey's jaw set very slightly. Dr. Whitfield leaned forward with a clinician's involuntary engagement before recollecting himself. Diana Thornfield's eyes flicked from canvas to company and back again, swift and exact. Mr. Thornbury, paler than the day before, but steadier, took in the ledger with a kind of weary recognition. James Windmere's fingers, restless on the arm of his chair, found and refound the same polished groove. His gaze avoided the bell-pull. "If I may," Professor Hartwell murmured, half to himself, "memory has taken its proper shape." Alleyn did not inquire, just then, what anyone understood. He let the painting do his early work. When he spoke, it was with a mildness that was not indulgence. "Miss Harcourt, Lady Cordelia instructed you, I think, in the choice of certain emblems." "She did," Miss Harcourt said. "She wished that those who knew would know." "And those who did not," Alleyn returned gently, "would not be made a spectacle of ignorance." "Quite so." He rose and moved to the French windows. They were latched. On the inner frame he noted again the small nick where a thread had caught. The curtains, heavy brocade with a narrow border of worked green, stood composedly at either side. The color was not the same green as Miss Harcourt's dress of 2 nights past. Similar enough to mislead a hasty eye, different enough to satisfy a patient one. He lifted the hem between finger and thumb. A faint abrasion marred the selvage. He turned back. There are small conveniences in any well-governed house which become, by use, invisible, until they are disturbed. Lady Cordelia's bell, for instance. It will save time to say that it was intentionally rendered silent some days ago. Her spare spectacles were made less accessible by the simple act of shutting a drawer that was customarily left half open. Her customary cup was exchanged for a glass that could carry what it must without remark. A letter, written on excellent paper, arrived without a postmark. He let the items assemble themselves in the room like modest guests returning at the appropriate moment. I've asked Inspector Fox to make certain inquiries about the paper. Such stationery is a club convenience in London. Several clubs, indeed, with the same merchant behind them. No accusation attaches to any member by reason of a writing room. His glance, courteous to a fault, took in Sir Geoffrey and Professor Hartwell with equal impartiality. But convenience, you will agree, is a treacherous ally. "Inspector," James said, and checked himself, as if the objection he had intended to make had already betrayed its own source. "I mean, this is extraordinarily unpleasant." "It is disagreeable," Alleyn agreed, "but it has the saving grace of being finite. The truth always is in the end." He asked then, not abruptly, but with the tact of one requesting a signature in a condolence book, that each of them note a brief acknowledgement of their presence last evening, for the record. Mrs. Kempton supplied a folder of clean sheets. "Forgive the bureaucratic inelegance," Alleyn said, as he laid the papers upon a small table. "A simple line, if you please, and your name. Nothing more." They came, one by one, to write. He attended to none of them, and to all. Hand, pressure, hesitations. These were not proofs, but human habits, and habits, correctly placed, tell their tale. When it was done, he closed the folder without a glance and gave it to Fox, whose imperturbable presence had something of the sentinel about it. "There is one thing more," Alleyn said, and in the small pause before he continued, the room reassembled its breath. Last night someone, anxious to ensure that no fresh order might be imposed on a long disorder, searched Lady Cordelia's papers and, finding an obstacle, sought to remove it. Mr. Thornbury, I'm glad to see, will recover. It was, in any case, a clumsy echo of a more careful act. He did not look at Dr. Whitfield. He did not look at anyone with more attention than civility required. "I shall ask you, for the remainder of the day, to remain within the house and its gardens. No formal constraint," he added, with a fractional smile that made the request more binding than any order. "Only what is owed to your hostess." He allowed the assembly to dissolve itself. People slid into side conversations, each of them managing their own version of composure. Alleyn, who had not once raised his voice, went to the easel and, with a gesture that was almost reverent, drew the silk back across the painting. "Later," he said to Miss Harcourt, so softly that only she could hear. He asked then, in the same tone with which one proposes a stroll after luncheon, if a certain person, he did not announce the name, would give him 10 minutes in the morning room. He said it without emphasis. Only Inspector Fox, catching the tiny alteration in his chief's cadence, turned his head the bare degree that signaled attention. The passage seemed longer than it was. As they went, Alleyn noted trivialities with the unhurried exactness that is sometimes mistaken for indifference. A faint scratch upon the dado at shoulder height, a square of carpet where the pile lay imperfectly brushed, the light upon the water in the crystal decanter Mrs. Kempton had sensibly replaced with plain glass. In the morning room, the chair stood where it had stood. The air had the cooled, shut fragrance of flowers whose meaning had altered overnight. Alleyn closed the door not to trap, but to shelter. He took no notes. He set no trap of legal phrases. "I've asked you," he said, and here the courtesy deepened to something personal, "because you have carried a weight that has altered the set of your nature. It takes time to observe such changes. We have had just enough." There was, for a space, only the slight sound of breath in a quiet room. When the answer came, it was not a confession. It was the smallest surrender, a hand that, resting on the edge of the table, ceased to perform steadiness and lay still. "We shall not be theatrical," Alleyn said, as if replying to a suggestion. "There is, I think, a way to do this that will neither disgrace the dead nor cheapen the living, but it requires now that I have from you one true word." Outside, a cloud shifted, and a narrow blade of sun struck across the terrace-flagged stones, so that the French window made a mild, imprecise mirror of the room. In it, the two figures were no more than shadows. Fox, waiting by design at a distance that honored the privacy of what must be said, glanced once toward the bright line on the stone and then away again. Alleyn waited. He had always been a man with a talent for waiting. The word, when it came, was very soft. He inclined his head, as at the end of a ceremony, and, without touching, conveyed the sense of a hand taken and steadied. "Thank you," he said. "We will do it with as much quiet as the circumstances allow." He opened the door and the house resumed its breath. What remained would be done among them all, and done, if Alleyn could manage it, without the slightest raising of a voice. The drawing-room at Windmere House received them as it had received so many polished evenings, though now the hush was of another order. Alleyn had asked that they assemble after luncheon. He stood a little apart from the fire, his hands lightly clasped, his manner courteous, almost diffident. It was not a court of judgment. It was a room in which people had talked for years, and he meant to keep it so. "Before we proceed," he began, "I should like to say that I am indebted to you all for your forbearance. A death in such surroundings invites haste and sensation. We have attempted neither." A stir from James, quickly suppressed. Miss Harcourt sat very straight, her face pale but composed. Dr. Whitfield had chosen a chair at the edge of the circle, and looked, if anything, more tired than the situation strictly demanded. Sir Geoffrey, immaculate and motionless, had positioned himself with an instinct for vantage that spoke habit rather than calculation. Alan's voice remained level. "The circumstances of Lady Cordelia's death are not consistent with a natural passing. The bell wire in this room has been cut for some days. Her sedative was increased beyond therapeutic measure. Her reading glasses, without which she did not examine correspondence, were absent. The drawer that holds a spare pair, usually left ajar, was found closed. The French window was set slightly open in a house where draughts were anathema, and a letter, unstamped, delivered by hand, summoned her here at a precise time. He let the items settle, one by one, like cards in a slow, unshowy trick. The writing upon that letter was disguised, yet in the formation of the capitals there is an idiosyncrasy. The T formed without a cross-stroke until the pen returns, giving a faint double pressure. Our concerned friend left the same signature upon a second, private admonition to Miss Harcourt yesterday morning. Both were written on an excellent cream-laid paper with a faint watermark. Mandrake and Sons, St. James's, which, I find, is supplied to certain London clubs and regimental messes. Sir Geoffrey did not move. A brightness, almost like interest, kindled in Professor Hartwell's eye, and went out again. Lady Cordelia had commissioned a portrait that was also a document, Alleyn continued. Miss Harcourt, at her request, employed symbols: a pheasant with a broken pinion on the moor, a gun strap frayed where it meets the swivel, and, very delicately handled, the suggestion of a sash of green looped over the horn of a saddle. The particular shade is not fashionable. It is regimental. James made a sound, half protest, half breath. Diana laid a hand upon his sleeve. It stilled him. 30 years ago, Alleyn said, Charles Windmere died in what was called a hunting accident. He had written to his sister that morning, afraid. He believed he had uncovered irregularities in accounts he thought were his family's concern. In fact, as I suspect from papers disturbed 2 days ago, the irregularities belonged elsewhere, debts and losses that had to be concealed quickly if a career was not to end in ruin. He turned his gaze upon Sir Geoffrey, and in it there was nothing of triumph. You were Charles's friend. You were a guest in this house as often then as now. You knew the coverts, and you understood how a worn strap, a loosened catch, a small deficiency in care at the right moment, might be accepted as accident upon a damp October morning. You were also in a position to be believed when you said it was so. Sir Geoffrey's eyes met his. They were the eyes of a man who had once looked upon distances and found them manageable. "You have made a neat pattern, Inspector," he said. The voice was steady, almost courteous. Alleyn inclined his head. "It is a pattern that continues. This week, a bell wire severed in advance. A letter phrased to touch Lady Cordelia's exact sense of duty. The substitution of a glass for her customary cup. A decanter in the sitting room, tainted so lightly that a man might be confused and silenced for an hour, not killed, when he began to read what you could not permit him to read. The papers in Lady Cordelia's safe, replaced almost as she kept them. You have known this household as long as Frobisher, Sir Geoffrey. Longer, perhaps, in some respects." "It is an old fault," Sir Geoffrey observed, with something that might have been fatigue rather than irony, "to suppose that access proves intent." "Access proves opportunity," Alleyn said gently. "Intent reveals itself in the line it takes to preserve a life already built. It was not money now, but memory. You recognized the shade of green upon Miss Harcourt's canvas. You knew what it meant to Lady Cordelia. You knew what it would mean to you. There was a silence of a different kind then. It was as if the house itself withheld its breath on behalf of an old guest. James rose, sat, rose again. "He is my godfather," he said finally, speaking to the rug. "He taught me to take a gun apart and put it together. He—" Sir Geoffrey lifted a hand, almost affectionate, in the air. "James," he said, "do sit down." He turned back to Alleyn. "If I were to say that what was done then was done in the conviction that it spared a greater harm, would you understand me?" "I should understand that you believed it," Alleyn replied. "I should also understand that Lady Cordelia did not." Sir Geoffrey's mouth shaped what might have become the smallest of smiles and thought better of it. "She always was a formidable creature," he said softly. Dr. Whitfield, who had been still throughout, found his voice. "My God," he murmured, not in horror, but in recognition of something long suspected, and at last named. Alleyn took a breath that was almost, though not quite, a sigh. "Sir Geoffrey, I must ask you to accompany me presently. Not now, not in front of everyone. There are forms. If you wish to write letters, you may do so in Mrs. Kempton's presence, and there is one more matter that concerns Miss Harcourt's work, which we shall settle with care." Sir Geoffrey inclined his head, as if to an equal. "You are considerate, Inspector." "It costs nothing to be so," Alleyn said. He turned to the room. "There will be no statements tonight. No one will leave Windmere House. We have, all of us, lived with this truth for longer than we knew. Another few hours will not hurt it." Outside, the afternoon deepened into the grey of a Kentish evening. The fire settled. No one spoke. It was not relief, precisely, that moved through the room, but the recognition of a weight finally measured, if not yet taken up. In the servants' passage, somewhere out of sight, a clock struck the half-hour, obedient to a mechanism severed and repaired. Alleyn glanced once at the covered easel, and then away. There would be time enough for that, and for what must come after. Windmere House met the morning with a kind of chastened composure, as if the old stones themselves had submitted to the knowledge that propriety, while admirable, was no guarantee against tragedy. The rain had ceased in the night, and the lawns lay glazed, the cedars holding their breath. Indoors, the household went about its tasks with unusual quiet, as though the memory of last evening's drawing-room disclosure required silence in lieu of comment. Sir Geoffrey Pembroke sent a note to Alleyn at 8:30, written in a hand that had signed orders on 3 continents. He asked, with crisp courtesy, for the favor of 15 minutes without interruption. Alleyn complied, not out of indulgence, but from that particular respect one extends to a man who has finally stopped performing. They met in the small gun room that opened off the back passage. Sir Geoffrey stood by the cabinet with its orderly, polished display. He had shaved. His collar sat perfectly. His eyes, pale and steady, looked over Alleyn's shoulder, past him, beyond him. "You will find me where you require me," he said quietly. "I do not propose to contest anything. It will not be necessary to parade it." "No," Alleyn said, "it will not." Sir Geoffrey's gaze drifted to the window. "The business of Charles," he said, using the familiar name with a soldier's economy, "was untidy. It has been tidy for 30 years. Lady Cordelia had a gift for exactitude. She could not leave it so." Alleyn did not reply. Words he knew could be indecent when silence had already said everything. At 10 minutes to 9, Sir Geoffrey stepped into the morning room. Mrs. Kempton, anticipating with unerring tact, had drawn the curtains for privacy. When he emerged, it was with the same soldierly uprightness. He asked Frobisher for his hat and gloves. Then, with a formal bow to Mrs. Kempton, he presented himself to Alleyn. There was no audience. Fox, unobtrusive as furniture, stood at the far end of the corridor. "I shall not burden you with reminiscences," Sir Geoffrey said. "Nor requests. One tries to behave even at the end." Alleyn inclined his head. "Thank you." They walked out together. There were no handcuffs. In such moments, Alleyn believed, dignity was not a concession to the guilty, but a final courtesy to the truth reluctantly brought to light. In the drawing room, life resumed its attenuated pattern. Mr. Thornbury, pale but recovering under Dr. Whitfield's eye, spoke in a murmur of trusteeships and temporary arrangements. "There will be time," he said, "to set the estate in order. Lady Cordelia has made provision for the village, as one would expect." James Windmere stood by the empty easel, hands in his pockets, staring at the silk cover as if it concealed judgment rather than art. When Diana joined him, he did not turn. "I'd been groomed for a kind of airship," he said. "Not to the acres, to the myth." "Then perhaps," Diana said gently, "you're free of it." He laughed without humor. "Free to discover what sort of man I am without Aunt Cordelia's steadying hand. Not the liberty I wanted." Miss Harcourt came in then, a slim figure in yesterday's green, the color softened by the morning light. She paused at the threshold, looked toward the covered canvas, then away. "It needn't be unveiled," she said to Alleyn, who had returned with the almost imperceptible alteration of expression that follows a completed duty. It did the work she asked of it. "It may also do a different work," Alleyn said. "One of remembrance rather than indictment. But that choice is not mine." Miss Harcourt nodded. "There is a study in the corner of the canvas, a small detail no one would see unless it was shown them. A hawk at stoop." She insisted. "For Charles," she said. "He loved the birds. He would have understood being struck from above, cleanly, without warning." I told her it was cruel. She said it was accurate. Mrs. Kempton, carrying a tea tray with the same unflustered competence that had steadied this house for years, set it down and stood for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. Her ladyship would have preferred the garden door opened of a morning. She observed to no one in particular. It freshened the room. Alleyn glanced at her. "You suspected," he said, not as an accusation. "One learns to recognize the shape of a secret, sir," she replied. "Not its contents, only the weight of it." Dr. Whitfield, grave and oddly tender, arranged Thornbury's cushions with a physician's fussing that was really affection. "Sedatives are a blunt instrument in clumsy hands," he murmured, "and devilish subtle in practiced ones." Charles's killer was practiced, Alleyn said. The doctor nodded once, accepting the economy of that statement. I shall send you my final notes. The motor car took Sir Geoffrey away without ceremony. In the corridor, the sound faded, and with it a portion of Windmere's old certainty. James, after a long silence, reached for the silk cloth. He hesitated, then let his hand fall. Not yet. Inspector, he said almost boyishly, does it end here? In court, Alleyn replied, and beyond court, in time. He looked about the room. The easel, the fire laid but not lit, the faint impress of Lady Cordelia's presence still held in the arrangement of objects she had ordered. Houses like this keep their own account. They balance it sooner or later. Outside, a rook lifted heavily from the cedar and went laboring into the pale sky. In the servants' hall, someone laughed too quickly and then stopped. The day, having absorbed what it must, moved on with the stubborn, merciful progress of days. There was no triumph in any of it, only the stillness that arrives when a long-maintained fiction finally releases its hold. The household arranged itself for the evening with that fragile precision of politeness that follows shock. Tea was brought and scarcely touched. Fires were coaxed to an even burn. Lamps were adjusted to the precise height at which conversation may continue without demanding it. In such light, the company's features were softened, their edges blurred, yet Alleyn found the human textures clearer than they had been in daylight. He chose not to summon them at once. The day had done enough summoning. Instead, he allowed the drawing-room to breathe while he took a slow circuit of the corridors that ran like discreet arteries behind the public rooms of Windmere. In the passage to the morning-room, he found Mrs. Kempton, her hands folded, her gaze fixed upon nothing in particular. "You have already told me more than most people in my position are offered," he said gently. "I wonder if there is just one thing more." Her lips compressed. The decision cost her something. 3 days ago, Mr. James asked for the step-ladder. He said the bell had been ringing intermittently and must be catching somewhere. I told Stevens to see to it, but Mr. James had already attended to the matter. "The bell wire to the servants' hall?" "Yes, Inspector." "Thank you." Alleyn inclined his head. "It must be difficult." "It is not my place to judge the family," she replied after a moment. "Only to serve them. Sometimes the distinction is less clear than one might wish." Back in the drawing-room, the quiet was like the aftertaste of a strong tea, persistent, a little bitter. Professor Hartwell, who possessed the rare gift of silence, sat watching the fire as if it, too, might stump at dawn. Dr. Whitfield maintained a humane check upon Mr. Thornbury, whose pallor had improved, but whose nerves had not. Sir Geoffrey stood a little apart, the set of his shoulders suggesting fatigue deeper than the day's labor could account for. Miss Harcourt had retreated to a chair near the covered easel, her hands folded in an attitude that looked like prayer and was, perhaps, simply endurance. Diana Thornfield, with a journalist's attention to currents, watched everything without appearing to watch anything. Alleyn crossed to James Windmere with the apologetic air of a man asking for one more small imposition. "If you could spare me 10 minutes, Mr. Windmere. A breath of air might be useful." James acquiesced with a shrug that strove for nonchalance and came near to it. On the terrace, the damp evening held the scent of turned earth and cut box. A pale moon rested in the crook of a cloud, observant and remote. They walked without speaking for a little, their steps measured, their breath visible. "I should like to understand your aunt's habits with the bell," Alleyn said at last, as if taking up a conversation broken off earlier. "An odd subject, but such things often are. I'm told you were so good as to adjust the wire 3 days ago." James's pause was almost imperceptible. "It had been jangling, drove the staff mad. I mended it as any man would. There's no mystery." "No. It is more often the absence of mystery that troubles me." Alleyn's voice was mild. "The wire appears to have been cut, not caught. The small sort of cut one makes with a pocket knife, neatly done, then left to tarnish. One would not necessarily expect a man to carry a knife with such a fine edge. An officer might, a pilot might. James's laugh was soft and perfectly agreeable. You flatter the RAF, Inspector. Alleyn allowed the diversion to pass. Your aunt was a woman of great exactitude. She read with glasses, kept a spare pair to hand, and preferred warm milk to spirits in the evening. Last night the glasses were not used, the drawer that should have been inviting was fastidiously closed, and a liqueur glass performed duties for which it was not intended. These are small departures. Yet it is departures that build into a journey. You mean she did not die as she lived? James said. Is that it? I mean somebody arranged for her not to, Alleyn answered, with a courtesy that made the words bearable. They turned at the stone urn and came back toward the French windows. Inside, the covered easel threw a slender shadow. James's eyes went to it and away again. That thing, he said abruptly. You'll have it taken away, won't you? It's indecent, parading grief before it is settled. Miss Harcourt's work may be less a parade than a statement, Alleyn said. Statements can be inconvenient. They can also be useful. You do enjoy your abstractions, James murmured. He stopped, his breath a little quicker for the first time. What do you want of me, Inspector? A confession? A tear? I can offer you neither. Neither would be of use, Alleyn returned with the same unruffled calm. What I should like is your patience for a short while longer. In a little time, when the company is ready, I shall ask for a quiet talk together. There are certain facts to be put upon the table, and it is better they should be set there by me than thrown by someone else. They re-entered the room with the same manners with which they had left it. Conversation resumed by inches. The fire settled, as if relieved to have survived another inspection. Alleyn took up a position not at the head of anything, but where he could see all faces clearly and all hands at rest. It was a tableau that had learned, painfully, to hold itself together. He would, soon, ask it to loosen. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the quarter with the delicacy of porcelain struck by a spoon. Alleyn glanced at it without haste. The time for performance was drawing near. He felt, rather than thought, that in a few measured sentences the air would change. Not violently, but as mist when a wind turns. He saw Mrs. Kempton at the doorway, met her gaze, and inclined his head. She withdrew. The stage, such as it was, had arranged itself. It asked only for the gentlest of cues.